Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with another week of World War III analysis. We've got a decent amount of stories today, a lot of elections actually from Iran, France, the UK, some reshuffles in the European Parliament, a lot of international diplomacy going on with Orban, Modi visiting Moscow, Assad visiting Turkey. We're going to talk about some top Hezbollah generals killed, big escalations on the way. We anticipate Israel's invasion of Lebanon sometime this month, so we're going to be analyzing the ground right now. Big things going on in Myanmar. We haven't talked about former Burma very often recently, but the junta continues to lose ground there as the People's Defense Forces and the anti-junta liberal forces continue to take different cities across the region, and there's other things going on in Africa, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Cyprus. We're going to get into all of that, but we've got some other things to talk about as well, some big things in the work here. But Dmitry, how are you doing? I know we've been putting in some work behind the scenes for some new content.
Yeah, doing well. Good to be here again. And, there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. We're just finalizing the last touches, the final edits on the Ritual Regicide Part 2 release, which I don't even think it's appropriate to call it an article at this point. It's more than likely it will be the next quarter of the book that we'll be releasing, which should be published before the end of this year. That's the guess. But yeah, just finalizing that, just making sure that all the spelling errors are fixed, and of course all the citations and references are in, because that release will be, again, quite large as well, close to 20,000 words. So you guys will have an opportunity to read that very shortly. The plan is to release it before the 17th of July, which will be, of course, the commemoration of the Romanov Royal Martyrs this year in 2024. And of course, we anticipate that week, which I think it will be probably episode 82. We'll cover it on World War Now. It'll be a massive event in Russia, as always every year it is, the 17th and the 18th of July, the Alapayevsk martyrs, the royal martyrs, and those who passed away with them are usually celebrated via a massive church procession which takes place in central Russia. And it's a big time of, say, national unity. And in many ways, the Holy Romanov martyrs, they are the most important saints in modern Russia in terms of understanding where Russia is going politically, culturally, and also in regards to Russia's rebirth. Because I think when the Russian people actually understand what took place more than 100 years ago now, only then will they realize where the country needs to go as a whole. And until that happens, speaking about economic, GDP rates and demographic growth and, the 2.1 birth rate, things like that, these minutia details are essentially just that, small details which simply won't change the bigger picture, I think. And politics in general, this obsession with liberalism, democracy, I think all of that is a massive distraction. I think for the Russian people, this weird talk about elections, which is why I'm glad that these Russian elections went by in 2024 without much development. So this Ritual Regicide Part 2 article will be dropping very, very soon. I would say in about less than a week. So looking forward to that. And of course, probably before the end of this year, Conrad, we are working on a few very special guests in July, but we will also be completing the Nicholas Kozlov book, at least the first of his books, which we'll be completely releasing, I think, very shortly. That's, of course, Ritual War, which Ritual War, initially, when we first started publishing it, Conrad, the translation, maybe certain people were like, well, how is this relevant, guys? The Caucasus War, Dagestan, Chechnya, the history there. And then suddenly, tragedy does take place, and we're not, of course, fond of that, but these books are relevant, and we knew they were relevant when we began translating them and editing them, because this region will, of course, incur further attention going down into the future. It does touch upon very interesting strings and does touch upon eschatology in an orthodox sense, and of course, geopolitics in the Caucasus region. I think this is a really important zone, when not just talking about Armenia, Azerbaijan, but also Georgia, and just north of that, Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia, and all those very key areas which, they're involved in a lot of major news, as we know from recent times. So that book, I think, will have a lot more relevance going into the future, which is, a great honor for us to be translating it. So big thanks to Nicholas Kozlov for putting it together for us. But lots of great things taking place in July and the rest of 2024. We have a really good timeline for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to part 2 of the St. John Vatatis episode with Gregory Hears. We've got Andrei Afanasyev returning, of course, and a bunch of other new guests that I don't want to spoil, but people should look forward to. Also, brief life update. I myself am leaning into World War Now full time. My previous job, I am no longer doing that. That took up a lot of my time during the day. So hopefully there will be a lot more original writing from me as well. Dimitri's been grinding on his translations, and I do edit those, so it's not like I'm doing nothing, but I wanted to, since this started, always have something akin to even a weekly or maybe bi-monthly articles on the Substack as well with my thoughts on politics, metaphysics, maybe some of these other things. So get behind the paywall. Let us know if you want to see that. If I see a boost in the paywall this week, I'll get on that even more soon than I already planned to. So look forward to some more writing there. And again, like I said, some great guests. But with all of that, let's dive right into World War III this week. I wanted to start with the Iranian election and say that, Dimitri, we were wrong on this one. Not to say that we get things wrong all the time and that this was really that consequential, but you know, this was one thing that we did see based on the previous first round turnout and results of the Iranian presidential election, which took place within 50 days of the death of Ibrahim Raisi, the previous president of Iran who died in that helicopter crash. He was replaced now by Masoud Pezeshkian, who we had mentioned before as the Turkic Azeri reformist, the more moderate candidate who is in favor of restricting the morality police, not enforcing a lot of the Sharia law things regarding women and other more conservative policies. He defeated Saeed Jalili, who was the principalist candidate, who, again, based on my analysis of the first round, I thought was going to win because he only lost by, they lost by 1 or 2% of the vote. And then the third candidate, who got almost 1 million votes himself, was aligned with the principalists. But what I wasn't anticipating was that the second round would have 10% more turnout across Iran than the first round. So clearly the minorities around Iran turned out. And if you look at the map, we'll probably have that in the thumbnail. You can see that the heartland of Iran, the center voted for Jalili, and that the minority exurbs, the outskirts of, the empire, as it were, especially Iranian Azerbaijan in particular, came out very strong for Pezeshkian. So this is very interesting. Jalili immediately conceded and supported Pezeshkian again, even though they appear and sound like they come from different sides of a broad political spectrum. There's not that much political wiggle room in Iran. Again, the president is not the same as being the president in the US. Ultimately, the Ayatollah is the supreme leader and the head of state and has a lot of influence over the government, but the president does obviously sway the path that Iran is going to take. And Iran is basically handing the West the Iranians are presenting a white flag, not really a white flag, but a peaceful offering to the West, saying that we have no interest in cascading perpetual escalations. They've elected this reformist. He is down to continue talks with the West with the Iranian nuclear deal and these other things. And I guess we're going to see if the West and its leaders, the Israelis, will allow them to take this olive branch from the Iranians at all. But I think the fact that he got 16 million votes versus the other guy getting 13 million, 54% versus 45%. I don't want to say like huge landslide, but definitive win, not entirely as close as it even could have been. So interesting developments in Iran. I want to hear your thoughts, Dimitri.
Yeah, I think we can't consecutively say that it was a stolen election or anything like that. It wasn't as close as even the Trump-Hillary election or the Trump-Biden election, right? So we can't really make those comparisons, even though, in my view, democracies and these sort of broad votes with millions and millions of votes either way are, of course, I think fraudulent to begin with in general. I think that's just the philosophical outlook on liberalism is very dim and it's not very solid, I think, as a political system going forward. But still, Iran is a revolutionary Islamic society. We need to keep this in mind. It's not a monarchist state. They're very much based on this post-French revolutionary idea of, well, we're going to be voting in leaders. We're going to be, it's a so-called theocracy, but it's not a theocracy with a Shah and an emperor or a classical, even Islamic caliph at the head. It's this weird neo-republican model, which even, this is why Saudi Arabia, no matter, like the crown prince did send his congratulations to Pezeshkian, but this is why the monarchies, right, which we spoke about with our special A for Hour with Isaac, we discussed the Hashemite monarchies of the Middle East, but this is why the typical Middle Eastern Islamic monarchies were always very skeptical of the post-Iranian revolution in Iran, because this is a very new sort of idea. There's a lot of, Islam does seem to birth very new ideas, both political and religious, over time. Well, probably because, in our view, it is a false faith, and so it does have these weird convulsions, right? Salafism, Wahhabism appear, of course, between in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and then now we have this weird idea of essentially a theocracy mixed in of liberalism. And Pezeshkian is and personification of that, right? And of course, we know Islamic society, for whatever reason, really prospered under the Shah in terms of they really appreciated the liberal type of reforms. And one way in which we can really clearly state, Conrad, when when we do analyze Iranian society back in the day during the Shah, and how they enjoyed liberalism, is because the birth rates were so high. In a very like modernizing society, it was very unusually high. It was, I think, over 4.0, which was like quite incredible for the time. And today, Iran is under replacement rate. So for whatever reason, this new regime, which is in Iran, has really made it, at least, is really affecting the psyche of the local people. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because a lot of Russian conservative political thinkers are stating that Iran is in this weird place where they need to, on one hand, appeal to the international coalition, these non-proliferation countries, which are stating that nuclear missiles should not be put into the wrong hands and should not be spread around the world. They the world peace crowd, and of course, Iran achieving nuclear sovereignty is, of course, one of the main issues here. And so Pezeshkian would be one of those figures, Conrad, who would stick to the status quo, who will not be seeking to obtain nuclear missiles, and most likely going to this Trump victory, which is, I think, we all speculate very generously that Trump will be the victorious in November, and he will be inaugurated in January of next year, most likely. Pezeshkian and the Iranian elites are probably looking forward to a very Obama-esque relationship with the new Trump regime. They won't be looking to escalate hostilities, and they're probably hoping very much that even before Trump wins the election at the end of this year, that the Hamas-Hezbollah situation also calms down, which, of course, we'll discuss later in the episode. But Pezeshkian's victory, of course, always, I think, underlines the reality that inside of Iran, there is this entire the gender battle ongoing as well. We've spoken about Iranian women, how they tend to be more liberal in terms of, like, if you look at the vast majority of Muslim countries, how the gender relations work out there. And of course, this reminds us of the September 2022 Masa Amini protests of the Iranian girl who died in police custody under mysterious circumstances. And this brought about essentially an entire year worth of post-COVID protests across Iran. And I think a lot of tension exists still to this day amongst the liberal-minded Iranians and the regime, the sort of so-called theocratic regime which is in place. And yes, a lot of this could have been like a Maidan-stoked type of riots and revolts within Iran, but I think Iranian society is quite complex, and this is why Pezeshkian is this middleman type of figure who he's not exactly the most theocratic type of guy, but he could appease some of those left-leaning people inside of the country, and could maybe sort of draw them away from any radical actions and perhaps push away the possibility of an Iranian Maidan going forward. So I think he actually benefits everybody, Conrad.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you just said, and the people that voted for him, like you mentioned, were those that were more supportive of those protests, like the Azeri Turks, the Kurds of Iran, and these other minorities. And speaking of, Turks, Erdogan expressed congratulations to Pezeshkian, and all sorts of Turkish political and media commentators and leaders even are saying that they believe Iranian and Turkic relations are about to dramatically improve now that, one of their ethnic kin, I guess, has gotten elected to the presidency. So interesting to see that. Turkey is also continuing to, trade oil with Iran. They have increased, I think, recent oil shipments to and from Iran, totally ignoring United States sanctions and others. So Turkey, as usual, playing both sides, NATO versus, the non-NATO bloc, Iran versus Israel, supporting both in some capacity. Of course, Turkey obviously fleeing the Israeli camp these days, but still secretly, doing some shipments and things despite disavowing them publicly. So perhaps this all was just a big victory for the Turks. And, maybe there is some truth to that. Maybe the Azeris took down the Raisi helicopter to get their guy in. I have zero evidence for that in any way, shape, or form, but, maybe that's what went down. But unless you have anything else to say about Iran, Dimitri, we should probably briefly mention the UK before we get into France and, the European Union, of which the UK is, no longer part. But who knows what that will change now that Keir Starmer is the prime minister. He talks about wanting to renegotiate Brexit. I don't know exactly what that means, if that means they could somehow rejoin the European Union. But Labour absolutely swept the Conservative Party. Reform, despite getting 14% of the vote, led by Nigel Farage, they're only going to take, I think, less than 10, maybe 13, I think is the most seats that they're going to end up with at the end of all of this, which, is a crazy meme when it comes to the whole democracy thing. But yeah, Labour, they're going to have 63% of the seats. They received 34% of the vote to the Conservatives' 24%. The Conservatives are going to have 19% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats, who are just the Labourists but even more retarded, are getting 11% of the seats. And then the Reform Party, led by Farage, despite getting 14% of the vote, 2% more than the Lib Dems, are only going to get 1% of all the seats. So 10% less, which is crazy. This shows you that the entire UK system is pretty much aligned against the interest of white British people and entirely elevates, the financier class, immigrants, and, sexual minorities, feminist women and their nonsense. So the UK truly has fallen in this regard. Obviously, Farage himself will be in the parliament. George Galloway lost by 1.5 thousand votes, so he's going to be out, which is very unfortunate to see. That's the problem with this Labour victory, is unlike in other countries, some of these more liberal parties, it might mean a victory for Palestine, something against Zionism, but Keir Starmer and his Jewish wife, I mean, he talks about how he celebrates Shabbat and does all the holidays and everything, and basically he's a product of, Keith Woods has written about this recently, how after Thatcher, basically Labour and the Tories merged together into just slightly to the center right, slightly to the center left versions of, pro finance, high level capitalism, Thatcherism. And that's what we're seeing now. The differences between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are extremely minimal. Sure, the Labour Party might be slightly harsher on Israel because of the liberal contingency in the Muslim base that they have in all of these seats that they've been elected to, but the leadership will not fundamentally alter Britain's policy towards the Israel-Palestine question. Obviously, the fact that Starmer not almost lost, but the second place candidate in his own seat was a pro-Palestine, anti-Gaza genocide candidate, shows that there's definitely some energy against his wing of Labour and everything, but there was just no way that the Conservatives were going to survive this. This is a devastating defeat, one of the most devastating defeats in political history for a major political party. And it was unfortunate that Reform couldn't sweep up more votes, but the system was, ultimately rigged against them.
Yeah, domestically speaking in the UK, there are rumors that Sir Keir Starmer is a Freemason, which is, very much a part of the British tradition. Not only are members of the nobility Freemasons, but also, members of the British House of Commons and various other political positions. Freemasonry, just as in post-revolutionary France and even slightly pre-revolutionary France, as well as modern Britain, it's very much a Masonic country politically speaking. This is where you need to be in these groups in order to get through. There isn't like, you don't have to be a member of any particular religion, but you do need to be a member of this exclusive club. So we do have to get a bit conspiratorial with this. And what's curious, you mentioned Conrad, Keir Starmer, like not only is his wife, essentially of that same group that was marrying a lot of various other Bolshevik and communist leaders during the Soviet Union. This was like part and parcel, part of that tradition. We literally spoke about it with Rachel on our recent A4 episode regarding occult feminism, right? And I think, notice we spoke about it then, and here we have a living example. Not just that, the comparisons between Bolshevism and Keir Starmer don't just stop there. The fact is that when he was a young man, and I think he probably continues to this day hold to these beliefs, that he's a weird social, not just a socialist of like a Stalinist communist type, like we see these MAGA communist Fed clowns online, but he's a Trotskyite, like in the literal sense, like he believes in a global sort of revolution, on the proletariat need to unite, this sort of thing. And he's not just a dummy who pushes these ideas. He's a lord in terms of like, he's been knighted. He's a king's counsel, a very high level barrister, which is a very distinct sort of position, a very skilled lawyer, I think, in all regards in the UK legal system. So this is a very smart man who still chooses the wrong path, and this is almost an antichrist level. And yes, some people are like, wow, look, we finally have a white man in power again. But I'm sorry, like the king is white. You don't need, it's even scarier when you have a white man with like, blonde hair, light eyes, a strong jawline, typical masculine Nordic features, with a Jewish wife who has, and he himself carries these destructive, literally Talmudic ideas, which were birthed at the beginning of the 20th century and have ended, essentially brought the world to the stage wherein it is now falling apart and degenerating. And his opponent, Rishi Sunak, like what can we even say? Like the Rishi Sunak was like the British version of Macron, Goldman Sachs banker, big time into economics, this weird ties to the Rothschilds family, similar to Macron as well. It's very questionable characters. Naturally, we do have Nigel Farage winning some traction in this election, but Keir Starmer, yeah, things are not going to get better in the UK or Great Britain before they get worse. And this is, I think, the unfortunate thing is because the Orthodox Church in Great Britain is always and it's always developing, it's always going forward. Religion is actively falling apart. The Anglican Church is collapsing under the effects of liberalism, right? And I think this election of a new pro-immigration, weird labor communist Trotskyite leader who is incredibly smart and knows how to manipulate the system and probably has a lot of strings attached is, I think, going to make the situation even worse. It's, in a way, an acceleration. In other sort of news, Conrad, we do have George Galloway, of course, losing his seat by 1,500 votes, which is really not much. It's essentially like the size of like a middle or a high school and maybe a couple of streets in his particular voting region, which brings around a lot of questions as to how exactly did he lose by such a close margin, given his immense popularity online and probably in terms of like out of all the British politicians active in Albion, he is one of the most outspoken and probably one of the most popular at the moment on the interwebs.
Yeah, the Jews ran a Thomas Massey on him, but, this time it's the UK, so it was able to actually work, unlike, the good people of, northern Kentucky. They were unswayed by the APAC ads against Massey, but it appears that Galloway was not so lucky. And he ran smart campaigns. He would send pro-Gaza ads to his large Muslim constituents and then pro-white basically ads to his white British constituents, and therefore he won the seat the first time. Obviously, that's a dangerous combination that the political establishment on both sides are going to want to attack. So obviously he wasn't getting any help from the Conservatives, from the Tories. I know he offered to align with Farage. I don't know if what the response was to that. Probably not good because Farage himself was also a big Zionist. But to move a bit across the channel, we have to talk about the big elections in France, which are having big reverberations into the rest of Europe. But it seems that, as usual, the entire political apparatus united to prevent the quote-unquote far right from taking power. Because what happened was, of course, the highest percentage of the votes, what should have ultimately probably been the most seats, was National Rally, Le Pen's party. They gained 6.5 million votes since their previous election. And again, like I said, far and away the highest vote getter, just like those nonsense statistics in the UK were getting huge percentages of the vote, huge quote unquote democratic support, as these people like to say, only for these parties to get almost no representation because of silly systems that have been implemented. But the results in France, of course, we saw the new left front, as I guess it is being called, which is pretty much a catch-all united left-wing party. They got a little over 7 million votes and 180 seats. Ensemble, the Macron alliance, got 6.6 million votes and 159 seats. National Rally, they got 10.1 million votes and will have 143 seats. And then the Republicans, who are like the moderate kind of conservatives, they got 2.5 million votes and are getting 67 seats. And then, 20 or so seats were split between two other tiny parties that no one cares about. So again, the left and Macron are forming this sort of unity government that Macron and Attal say they will hand off to the left-wing leadership, with Mélenchon and these other characters, after a few months if the alliance stays in power. Unfortunately, the Republicans, in theory, might have been able to do something with National Rally if they wanted to, but it's kind of yet to be seen. It appears that apparently Macron and his party are actually looking at forming an alliance with the Republicans and still boxing out the far left and the far right, quote unquote, despite them being the two highest vote-getting parties by far. So once again, liberal democracy is proving that it's just an, establishmentarian financier, bribery scam that always maintains frame within a Overton window that is desirable to, well, specifically world Jewry, but also, the financier class that imitates world Jewry and its usurious behaviors. So, as usual, politics, fake and gay, but it does show you, 10 plus million votes for National Rally, by far the biggest political force. France, the countryside, people are saying the entirety of the southern coast of France, with the exception of the little city of Marseille, it's all, National Rallies. So we should all be vacationing in the south of France, singing Ausländer raus and the other French and German anti-immigrant songs. But unfortunately, it appears that Bardella will probably not be the future prime minister of France, but we'll see how those things go.
Yeah, this is incredibly concerning because now the French legislature will be in the hands of the left wing. And this is like really scary because not just domestically, we know that France is in a really bad position immigrant wise. The attitude of this left wing is very pro immigrant. The majority of the immigrants are naturally Islamic from North Africa, but also the views of, say, the presidential election when it does go ahead. If the left wing bring in a popular left wing president, there will be some major concerns regarding international relations. We know France is one of those independent actors on the well, at least relatively independent actors on the world stage who still retain some of that sovereignty in terms of like Germany has very much lost most of its sovereignty, especially after Nord Stream 1 was sabotaged by the United States in 2022 after the commencement of the SMO. But we know that France still has like a very strong navy. It has nuclear capacities, has submarines, has a fairly strong, the French Foreign Legion is still a very strong force. It was spoken about very admirably by Gabriel de Roshan, the descendant of the Russian Orthodox Emperor Nicholas I, in some recent podcasts and interviews online on a lot of Russian websites. Who's been actually traveling around Russia giving interviews regarding his life in France growing up, the French right wing, the sort of path that France has taken. And he has mentioned that the French Foreign Legion at one point was even like a large portion of it was Russian, and essentially the descendants of the white emigre Russians who were base monarchists were joining that legion in order to upkeep their popular military traditions because most of these people were from military officer aristocratic families. So very curious sort of details there, but yes, it's very unfortunate because we do look at France's foreign policy, and our show does focus mostly on foreign policy. And you look at the Middle East, France's relation with Turkey, this competition that it has with Turkey, this support for Armenia, the fact that Pashinyan very much this like LGBTQ type character, even visually speaking, like physiognomy wise, you look at him and you're like, this man is not entirely straight. And I know we shouldn't judge as Christians, but it does it does beckon this sort of call to name names and point fingers. And once France really starts leaning into that left wing, I think it will build towards what the saints, especially the Greek Orthodox saints, were speaking about in terms of that war with Turkey, right? The fact that Greece will be supported by France. France will also be supporting Armenia, and the fires between Turkey and Greece will be stoked essentially by this weird left wing alliance of Greece and France, which we'll be building upon now, I think, especially since Greece has embraced left wing ideology. I think it's all related, Conrad, naturally, and this is really bad in terms of where the world is heading. Like, these prophecies are not being contravened, these people are heading straight for that great war which the saints speak about, unfortunately. And that's where I think the French election is really the bad news. But essentially, on the ground, we do have sort of the dulling of minds, of the degeneration of the senses of the French people, and the south of France. I'm not surprised those outside of the major cities, such as Paris, are looking at the big cities of the French, the French capital and some of those metropolitan areas, and they're seeing the destruction there. So perhaps the awakening eventually will happen, but will it happen in time before major mistakes occur geopolitically and within international relations? I'm just not sure. So quite grim, I think, overall. So yeah, we do hope that the French people awaken very shortly. But yeah, some of the clips coming from France at the moment, the protests, the pro-immigration slogans being thrown around, it's really quite dangerous. Almost as bad as the UK, except in the UK there really aren't many protests. So it's almost like the British people have already given up, but the French, at least I think we may be seeing some right wing protests very shortly commence over there. But yes, it's not looking too good.
Yeah, the French, they'll get out into the streets and protest, but I think some of the more disappointing aspects of all of this as well is, even though they're not going to be leading the government, Bardella, won't be appointed as the National Rally Prime Minister. The unfortunate thing is that we can't even be as excited about the European parliamentary victories as, National Rally becomes the biggest party in the European Parliament. This new Patriots for Europe group, which is basically being born out of the now defunct Identity and Democracy group. They are now the second largest, or no, they're the third largest group in Europe after, I think, the EPP and the ECR, the two other kind of mainstream center-left and center-right groups. And unfortunately, they might even have the chance to become the second biggest, but Le Pen and Orban, who are the two largest party leaders within this Peoples for Europe group, they are not fans of the AfD in Germany. Le Pen, of course, disavowed them and initially kicked them out of the Identity and Democracy group because of one of the party members comments that not every individual member of the SS was like an evil reprobate. And then and then the Fidesz party, we understand, also has general beef with AFD and isn't going to let them into the Peoples for Europe, despite the fact that all of the former Identity and Democracy members are looking to probably enter the group and have it be larger and more substantial than ever as the sort of identitarian, more nationalist leaning group in the European Parliament. But this is frankly only good for the at least reputation of the AFD, in my opinion, because despite liking Orban a lot and what he does, definitely more than Le Pen or Geert Wilders or Farage or any of these other characters in Western Europe who are total Zio shills, we have to be honest and admit that Orban is pretty much a Likud, operative. He and his party operate as far to the right as the Jewish right wing in Israel allows them to, and that means, of course, supporting Israel in its genocide against Palestine, voting against sanctions on Israel in the European Commission and Parliament, doing all of these things to support their war effort. And they're allowed to deport immigrants and be culturally conservative and be anti-gay and even be pretty pro-Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war, but they cannot even align with a party like the AFD, which, if you look at the other things they do, they completely line up. They're anti-LGBT, they're more pro-Russian than a lot of these European parties. They're, of course, anti-immigration, they want to do mass deportations, these other things. But because they're German and they're nationalistic enough to not buy into the extreme wing of the Holocaust guilt narrative, the World War II guilt narrative, they have, again, members of their party that are still willing to say, again, what I think is fairly milquetoast, but not just immediately say the most yellow-bellied nonsense that Germans usually do about their history and Germany and the Third Reich and Nazism. Because of that, pretty sure the Likudniks call up Orban and say, look, you can't support these guys. These guys are Nazis. They're this, they're that. They'll probably say, oh, they're collectivists. They're actually communists or leftists or whatever it is they'll say. But that's why Fidesz and the AFD don't get along. And that's unfortunately why, the People for Europe bloc is ultimately just, it's the good goyim block at the end of the day from a more nationalistic perspective. But it's good news for the AFD, and I've heard this many times, that around 40% of the AFD membership and party base and MPs and members and everything are part of the Bjorn Haka wing, who are, full-on nationalists that, aren't willing to say it with their chests, and, full Ausländer raus, and, not moaning and crying about what happened almost 100 years ago now during the Second World War. So, unfortunate reality in the European Parliament that if you're based at all, you're not getting anywhere in politics. But we've kind of realized this. We realize this is a spiritual reality that, orthodoxy and these other consciousnesses are going to have to rise. And as Dimitri said, these prophecies are going to be fulfilled and this war is going to have to come to pass. And then maybe a political reality can sync up more with epistemological reality and things will be a little less nonsensical with this liberal democracy meme we're living through.
Yeah, and one of those key regions, right, where a lot of these eschatological events will take place is, of course, the Levant, that Middle East region of Syria, Turkey. And this is where this next bit of news essentially comes from, where we finally see Erdogan. This is probably the episode of olive branches, Conrad. You've said it very correctly earlier. Erdogan sent a very kind message to President of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, stating, and I quote Erdogan, "We will extend our invitation to Assad. With this invitation, we want to restore Turkey-Syria relations to the same level as in the past. Our invitation may be extended at any time." So Turkey essentially is inviting Assad to visit, to restore diplomatic relations at any time. Whenever Assad feels comfortable, he can visit Ankara, or be it Istanbul, wherever he'd prefer, of course, wherever he'd like to meet Erdogan, and they could re-establish not just basic diplomatic relations, but also on a presidential face-to-face level, which I think is really kind of Erdogan to do this. But this is also, of course, naturally ties in with, I believe, like we spoke about last week, Turkey sort of now it's looking towards threats potentially from Greece, potentially this pressure from France. France, of course, being the main sponsor of not just Greece, Armenia, but also Georgia, all of these countries which view Turkey with a lot of skepticism. It's looking for new opportunities potentially in these other areas, right? Perhaps looking to close this issue down with Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so potentially this Syrian chapter of Turkish involvement will finally close down. And maybe it'll work with Syria together in order to curb the Kurdish question, no pun intended, because of course the Kurds, not only are they responsible allegedly for a lot of the terrorist acts that take place in Turkey, which is why Turkish counterterrorism is on such a high, in such a high standard, right? And they have caught a lot of the Ukrainian terrorists actually carrying and traveling explosives all around Europe. You think about it, all around the Black Sea, from Ukraine to Moldova, Hungary, Austria, Bulgaria, etc. They've allegedly been shipping, explosives and things like that, C4s, and they've been trying to get through Turkey in order to cause terrorist acts in the northern Caucasus, right? Which is quite a long journey if you think about it. Allegedly, Ukrainian terrorists are very ingenious, and so Turkish special operations have been stopping a lot of those shipments without really pointing fingers at the Ukrainian state. But nevertheless, Turkey is a very interesting country, and them stepping on the path of peace, I think, is kind of what we want, right? And especially Bashar al-Assad, the long-suffering president and his people. I mean, it's just, you really want this country to finally have peace, especially considering, like, as we'll discuss, what's taking place in the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, which is being bombed heavily by Israel. And it's just not a good look to be fighting amongst, say, brotherly Muslim countries when there's literally a Zionist state bombing Syrian airports in the desert, and there are these weird CIA, Mossad created ISIS cells operating within Iraq just around the corner. It's all very questionable, and of course all these various cultists and Kurds and whatever you may have in the desert. It's literally like some sort of MMORPG game happening in the desert right there, like it's Prince of Persia or something. It's just really bizarre, and it's time to make peace and actually deal with it. I think this is what Erdogan is coming to terms with, right? There's no more mucking around, because eventually this will spill over into Turkey, and we all know what took place in Turkey in the early 20th century, and there was bands marauding and non-government action sort of taking place in various villages. A lot of innocent people ended up dying. It's just all very, very dark. So I think this is probably one of those beneficial moments, and it does. We can kind of sink our teeth into this next massive diplomatic, moment, because on one hand, Assad has not visited, Erdogan yet, Conrad, but we do know who has visited Russia at the moment. And this is probably the biggest news story of the week, I can say. Well, almost, because it did make a lot of the headlines. A very interesting visit of Viktor Orban, the head of Hungary, traveled from Budapest on behalf, allegedly, as Putin said, on behalf of the European Union, first to Kiev and then to see Vladimir Putin, to pass on a certain message or to speak about potential peace terms between Russia and Ukraine, which, mind you, this was the position of Turkey and Erdogan for a long time, being the middle person. But finally, we have Viktor Orban. The Hungarians, the Magyars, are stepping up to the plate, and this very interesting visit took place this week.
Yeah, Orban visited Zelensky and Putin, and he sort of, again, as we were talking off air, Dimitri, nothing new was necessarily stated. Orban, on his way back, made all sorts of comments to the media about Putin, that he can't be beaten, how he has the natural resources on his side, he has the political goals that need to be achieved. There's literally no way that Russia can lose the current war in its situation, which is him, trying to convince the other European groups to stop their, silly financing of this fool's errand that is only going to go a certain direction. And him and Zelensky did appear to be a bit amicable when they first, shook hands at some of these summits and events. I do wonder how awkward that is, because obviously Zelensky knows that he's one of the few European leaders that just goes and talks to Putin and clearly is more inclined towards that end of the spectrum. But obviously, Zelensky has to play the part and play nice, because Hungary has those votes. It has that veto power in some capacity that they can always use. But I do wonder what the closed-door conversations between Zelensky and Orban really looked like, because at the same time as, Orban does have some power regarding Zelensky's aid and these things, Hungary is, a country of 10 million, and if it wasn't on the border with Ukraine as well, it would be even less relevant for him to go. But I'm wondering if he broached the subject of Hungarian, Transcarpathians being drafted en masse into the Ukrainian military and sent to the front lines for slaughter, because, again, we're seeing the amount of old men and 60-plus-year-olds with canes, at military recruitment offices, in their military, garb, their camo, ready to go to the front lines. And it's like, these guys can barely even walk. How is this going to be something that doesn't just lead to an eventual collapse and slaughter, when you could have just surrendered on the front line months ago? Like, you're going to lose more territory and people are going to die needlessly. So I'm wondering if Orban brought any of those subjects up. But Narendra Modi of India was also in Moscow. But yeah, Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on all of these visits and what Putin is thinking regarding the state of the war as it pertains to foreign policy and the relations with these other countries.
Yeah, Viktor Orban's visit does come, and I think we do need to pay attention to the timing in a lot of these international relations, collaborations, and events. The timing is super important. So, Prigozhin's death, for example, taking place literally like a week or two prior to the BRICS summit in August of last year was like a very key date, essentially to lower and drop Russia's reputation. I think this, like, we did pay attention to those details, and here we have very clearly Viktor Orban and essentially carrying this right wing message. And this is not my theory, but we did speak about it off air. A lot of Russian right wing political scientists and commentators were mentioning the fact that perhaps Viktor Orban carried an off air, off the books, maybe with no paper trail whatsoever, right? Because we do know a lot of Russia-Ukraine interactions with the US of Donald Trump. They do have a knack of being leaked, and Hunter Biden and all that. You don't want any emails, you don't want any paper trails, right? With these sort of trilateral interactions, shall we say, between any political elites, even lawyers breaking client legal privilege, during these various Senate hearings and weird stuff like that. So just completely off the books. But Viktor Orban could have brought a certain message to Zelensky and to Vladimir Putin from Donald Trump himself. We do know, like Viktor Orban is very fond of Trump. He, in a way, he's a very skilled politician, and in many ways, he precedes Trump in terms of political expertise and experience, and he's been in politics for longer than Trump has. But these European leaders do style themselves off of Trump's success in large part. So we do need to keep in mind. We do remember the Tucker Carlson interview as well. There are these right wing connections. I'm sure potentially he did mention something to Zelensky and Putin behind the scenes. What that was, would it be Trump's, like a draft of Trump's peace plan? Because Viktor Orban couldn't, right? This was the preliminary, this was the entree, the preliminary meeting with these two leaders. But I think the main carrier of the big olive branch, the sort of reef, the white flag of peace, will be Trump. Trump will be that man in the eyes of the world elite who will be given the opportunity to actually bring peace to the Russia-Ukraine conflict under certain terms. And Donald Trump would have the only leverage potentially to also bring about this, maybe even granting Putin these the entire Donetsk Oblast, which is reinforced by Ukrainian steel trenches, minefields, and fortresses. Handing that for free, giving that to Putin, potentially even giving him Zaporozhye and Kherson. Trump would be the only person on this planet with enough political power accumulated and reputation, and who could sort of leverage that and use that, not Viktor Orban. So Viktor Orban, very much, as you mentioned, Conrad, Hungary is not a giant country, Budapest is not a big city, it's very much a messenger type of role. Putin did joke that he was the representative of all of Europe, which is a bit of a meme because Viktor Orban is like the anti-EU politician in many ways. So it was a bit of an inside joke. So Putin still has a sense of humor, which is great. That means he's at least somewhat relaxed and not super tense. But yes, it's good that at least peace talks are happening. But this is not the peace talk. This is the preliminary sort of. It is not even like a peace discussion that took place in Turkey in early 2022. This is both parties not at the table. This is equivalent to the Switzerland clown meeting which took place. Like this Viktor Orban visit, Conrad. So I don't think we should inflate this with any sort of, in terms of claiming that it's more than what it should be. And even Modi's visit to Moscow, like the things he'll discuss with Putin, I'm sure will be very interesting, especially considering all the crude oil off the books shipments from Russia to India and things like that. These are very important visits, but it kind of, in a way, it brings us to potentially the other massive diplomatic meeting which took place. And this ties, I think, Turkey, Russia, and even Viktor Orban in many ways in China. It's the SCO summit which took place in Astana, Kazakhstan. If we want to briefly mention that, because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the meeting which took place in Astana, involved President Putin and Erdogan. And Putin, in front of Erdogan, claimed that Turkey was going to be the middle person between any future peace talks, right? So this essentially talk had Erdogan again shaking hands of Xi, shaking hands of Putin, and it showed the world this picture of solidarity that everyone agrees that peace talks do need to happen, but how will they be organized, and should they be on Western terms? Most likely not. And I think, this Viktor Orban visit very much shows that even the right wing in Europe, as soon as Trump's elected, it'll move into that potentially more peace-orientated side. But again, who knows? Because Valery Zaluzhny agreed, right, with Viktor Orban's assessment. He said that Ukraine will not be winning this war by means of arms unless it invents something equivalent to the invention of gunpowder in world history. So Ukraine will literally need to invent some sort of, Jewish space lasers, literally, in order to win the war. Like, it needs to create such a stretch of technology that will allow it to dwindle Russia's advantage at the moment. The advantage is so huge, and what it is ultimately we understand he's a little bit upset. He's quite salty over his recent firing, but still, I think his assessment is correct. So it's looking very interesting in Europe. But the peace talks are still not taking place. This visit is only a preliminary discussion of potentially the big discussions that will take place eventually, I think, between Putin and Zelensky, because we notice Zelensky is not being changed and not really changing the wheels. The train is using its old engine and its old apparatus system. Zelensky is still in the driver's seat, which is very curious and bizarre that they're investing so much into this strange clown figure.
Yeah, you mentioned Modi and you mentioned the SCO. It's curious that, Modi, he'll visit Moscow and he's interested in talking with Putin, but the tensions between China and India still exist. SCO voices have said that China and India are ready to begin dialogue on their border issues, which of course means Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh. We've covered those in previous episodes of they've had flare-ups with the US implicitly on some of its geological maps, implying that they recognize Arunachal Pradesh as Indian and not Chinese, despite China in certain areas having much more on the ground control. But you mentioned Turkey, of course, being this mediator. I think Turkey makes a lot of sense and always has been the most likely candidate for the mediator between the two sides as the other relevant power on the Black Sea. But we also see Armenia, Azerbaijan trying to have a peace agreement and come to that, with Kazakhstan offering to offer in its place. But another country that offered the Russia-Ukraine peace deal has been Bulgaria. I don't think Bulgaria has quite as much clout as Turkey to get what they want, but a lot of these countries, Hungary, Turkey, Bulgaria, Slovenia, even some of these places are coming out saying we want to help negotiate peace in Ukraine, so that that tide is moving farther and farther west as the calls for peace increase. But again, who knows? Escalations could occur that cause Russia to just dramatically take more territory. I do still think that something's going to have to be done about Sumy and these regions that border Bryansk and Belgorod and have used Western weapons to attack Russian civilians there. We, of course, see the Ukrainians lighting fires and sending bombs to light fires, kind of Hezbollah style, on the Russian side of the of the Kherson bank over the Dnieper River. And it appears that they're trying to prevent what is ultimately going to be a storming of Kherson city itself, and it'll be reclaimed at probably a similar time as Zaporozhye. I wouldn't be surprised if they launch those at a similar time once they clear up Donetsk and the other things going on in the north. But again, we're going to have to wait to see on that, because as of now, Israel is what we're anticipating with the invasion of Lebanon. We may have to circle back to some of these things with the SCO, because we know Belarus joined the SCO as well, and we see again ties between all of these countries regarding the Ukraine war dramatically increasing. We see Russia and China doing some of their first joint naval drills off the coast of Korea, between Korea and Japan, in the waters there. So a lot of dramatic escalations. I believe China even has taken some Taiwanese fishermen prisoner in some capacity. So there are escalations in the east that we are watching as well. But we have to talk about the Holy Land in Israel, of course, because Hezbollah has been dramatically increasing its strikes into northern Israel, onto places like Kiryat Shmona, into the Golan Heights. Dozens of dead Israelis are being evacuated from the Golan Heights because of these strikes. There's dead and wounded everywhere, and these are claimed to be in response to Hezbollah military commander Mohammed Naimi Nasser, who was the commander of the Aziz unit, one of the highest ranking generals or general equivalents within Hezbollah, killed by an Israeli drone strike in Lebanon. And so Hezbollah is dramatically responding to this with these huge missile salvos. And this comes amidst Israeli talks with Hamas to come to a ceasefire. And as it seemed that something was potentially about to be reached, Hezbollah said, the moment a ceasefire is reached in Gaza, we will also reach a ceasefire with Israel within the same hour. We'll stop fighting. And today, just very recently, as we're recording this, Yoav Gallant came out and said, who cares? That's total nonsense. What we do in Gaza has nothing to do with what we do with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So if they do reach some kind of ceasefire or halt or whatever in Gaza, even if it's for a limited time, it will probably be to invade Lebanon. It will have nothing to do with scaling down this escalating war in the region. And I'll wonder how Pezeshkian will respond to that, because Iran has talked about doing all sorts of things, maybe even entering Lebanon proper if something like that happens. So Pezeshkian, as president of Iran, he'll be in the hot seat very early on in his term. But Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on these missile salvos, and perhaps when, we had our episode with Isaac Swalem, the Palestinian Christian. He predicted Lebanese invasion in July as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think totally possible. And, Israel may have provoked, this moving a bit closer with the assassination of Mohammed Nasser, and this assassination reeks of like the Obama touch, that drone from the sky essentially shooting a missile and sort of precisely during the day on a busy street, taking out the Hezbollah commander in the town. So Israel, in fact, has also been taking losses from Hezbollah missiles, but the majority of the losses are, I mean, I think the ratio is something like 5-1. Most of the losses in this missile exchange between Israel and Hezbollah, this long range sort of artillery and missile land to land strikes, have been, and of course, Israel using its really dominant air force. It has been mostly Israeli successful, killing key Hezbollah leaders, including, Mohammed Nasser allegedly was the third most important senior commander killed in Hezbollah since October 7th. So this is really key. It does kind of change. Every time a commander dies, somebody else needs to really take his place. So there are reshuffles taking place, but in Hezbollah in southern Lebanon there, and of course we do know Hezbollah commanders are not just military commanders; they're also political leaders in their own right, and they have sort of a lot of influence in almost half of the country. Right? We did speak with Isaac really in depth about Lebanon. It's a very complex country, really tragic and complicated history over the 20th century. So definitely give that a listen because it does add context to a lot of these news stories which we report on a weekly basis. But naturally, the killing of this commander, of course, is an escalation. And in terms of missile strikes, we do have these missile strikes, Conrad, are causing a large displacement of people. We have over 60,000 Israelis actually losing their homes, having to move further down south away from the battle zone, and over 3 times as many, in the hundreds of thousands of Lebanese moving north towards Beirut and some of the more populated areas, which means these people are locking up their homes. They're leaving essentially their property vulnerable to marauders, thieves, etc., which of course exist in every society. And there's a lot of displaced peoples. It's similar to the Gaza situation, probably not as extreme at the moment, but it is a full-on war taking place at the moment in the north of Israel. There is a land invasion looming. The Israelis have the green light. It can happen at any time, basically any hour, whenever it's convenient for Israel, essentially. And Hezbollah has 100,000 soldiers ready to go. Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has confirmed this, and they have between 500,000 and then this number is staggering, 1 million missiles stockpiled. So Hezbollah has literally hundreds and thousands of missiles, and they don't need to fly far. I mean, it's only, 20, 30 kilometers south, and you're already hitting Tel Aviv, some of the main central hubs of Israeli decision making, and Haifa, places like that. Which, yeah, there are a lot of innocent people in those places, but also a lot of really key strategic points which Hezbollah will strike if a full-on war breaks out. So it'll be absolutely chaotic if a land invasion, of course, takes place. Which is why the American aircraft carriers are, of course, waiting in the wings in the eastern Mediterranean in order to support the greatest ally of the United States. So very concerning things taking place in the Middle East. Of course, this is probably why the Middle East is countries like Turkey and Syria moving towards peace, because they see what's taking place. And you're right, Pezeshkian, how will he respond? It's just incredibly concerning what's going to take place before our eyes almost any day now.
Yeah, I think again that imminent prophecy of Israel and America and the Jews striking Iran's nuclear capabilities. We'll see how Pezeshkian tries to maneuver his way back into the good graces of the more moderate American foreign policy apparatchiks that want to see an Iranian nuclear deal go forward. But as far as I'm aware, those people have all been purged out since October 7th and probably don't have any political clout at all. But we see the mayor of Kiryat Shmona, one of probably the main Israeli town that has come under fire and has been largely evacuated. He says that they will not return to the city, as in the Jewish residents, if a political agreement is signed with Hezbollah. So it's basically war or nothing. Like, we're abandoning this entire city if we don't basically expand the border and get farther away from the Goyim who launch missiles at us, despite the fact that, we're committing a genocide of their co-religionists and co-ethnics just a few hundred miles south. But obviously, we have to wait and see how the other coalition forces. We know that Syria and Iraqi resistance forces have pledged to enter Lebanon and fight with Hezbollah as one force. Perhaps Syria and Turkey agreeing, to recognize each other and, resume relations and cooperate. That will lead to, like you said, Assad taking care of some of the Kurdish problem and then Erdogan pulling out of Iraq and Syria and allowing these Shia resistance groups, which he ultimately has no real affiliation or affinity for, allow them to do what they need to do to help the Palestinians and Hezbollah. So watching all of these things very closely, but probably the hottest front this past week, excluding some of the things probably going on in across the entire massive front in Ukraine at a statistical level, because we know the Russians are making slow but sure advances pretty much across the entire front. We see Myanmar really heating up. We see the western side of the country really falling to, the People's Defense Forces, the anti-junta alliance, mostly made up of minority groups like Rohingya Muslims, Han Chinese, other groups, that feel oppressed by the main, like the Tatmadaw junta that recognize the Buddhist, Myanmar ethnic majority. And they have seen major cities fall. And we are finally seeing the junta respond to some of these large cities that have fallen to the resistance with actual missile strikes. Like some of these videos out of Myanmar, despite the fact that the missiles aren't quite as powerful, they do resemble some of this Ukraine footage. Finally, we're seeing World War III really heating up in this regard. So there's, urban missile shelling now in former Burma and Indochina. Very interesting. Who knows how long it's been since, the Vietnam War when this has really been going on. But here it is. And the missiles that the junta is using are, of course, mostly supplied by North Korea. So there's another parallel with the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, the U.S. hasn't been supporting the anti-junta forces as much as they probably could in the past, just because they're spread so thin, supporting Taiwan, supporting Ukraine, supporting Israel, supporting, probably dozens of covert operations in Iran, all of these other things. Apparently now, supporting Armenia, soft power in Europe. So the junta would probably have already fallen, frankly, if the U.S. was able to give the full support. Aung San Suu Kyi, the former, NATO-installed head of Myanmar, I believe she is still in prison. I don't know if one of the goals is to, free her and get her out after, she had attempted to steal the election, which was what caused the junta to take over. I, of course, am an OG supporter of the military junta for various reasons. I did actually meet some foreign ministers of Myanmar when I was in Russia, some very interesting characters. But the thing with Myanmar is that Russia and North Korea are actually much more inclined to overtly support them and directly, show solidarity with them against these resistance liberal forces than the Chinese themselves, because Myanmar and China have some weird border disputes at Myanmar's northern border. They're actually, ethnic Han minorities that are fighting against the Tatmadaw that view themselves as also sort of an oppressed minority group. Obviously, China is still generally more inclined towards the junta. They don't want a pro-U.S. proxy force on their southern border, but Russia has been willing to do joint military drills with the junta. They traveled there. Lavrov has been there. And again, North Korea directly arming them. So it's proving that, Russia-North Korea alliance very strong, and they're much more supportive of some of these, I guess you could say, multipolar powers than even the Chinese are, who are very tentative in a lot of things due to their trade relations and others with many Western countries that Russia and North Korea have basically been cut off from. So, Dimitri, before we cover some other stories and perhaps discuss the U.S. election a little bit, I'd love your thoughts on Myanmar.
Yeah, of course, it does remind us, Myanmar, of the some of the Cold War conflicts in Southeast Asia, and these essentially proxy countries, right? The country itself definitely has some civil unrest. People, are disputing certain points of cultural, political, or religious borders and issues, but essentially there is foreign influence, and this largely dictates as to how long the conflict will be, how disastrous it will be, and essentially where it ends when foreign support actually completely sort of stops flowing into the state. And it does remind me of that little anecdote of Mikhail Kalashnikov before he passed away in 2013 at the end of the year. This is the inventor of the AK-47, the Kalashnikov assault rifle, which is being used in a lot of the conflicts around the world. He did, I think he sent a letter to Patriarch Kirill, who was recently elected as the Patriarch of Russia, and he asked him, was it a sin creating the Kalashnikov rifle? And Patriarch Kirill, could you, forgive me for the sin of creating this, weapon which destroyed so many lives, especially in all these second and third world nations, etc., and like around the world. Kalashnikov, Africa, Southeast Asia, just really well known for taking a lot of lives. It's like a weapon, a tool of war. And Patriarch Kirill, I think he didn't forgive him. He just said, "Oh, don't worry about it," which Kalashnikov was like 93 or 94 at the time. Patriarch Kirill, I think, perhaps made a slight mistake. He should have perhaps at least given him a word of reassurance, telling him that, you're not really responsible for all those deaths. But that little anecdote and story sort of does paint the picture. Like these countries, like Myanmar, they are between a rock and a hard place. They are, Indochina and this Southeast Asian region, the ASEAN nations. We talk about Philippines being influenced by the US, etc. These countries are very much victims of foreign influence, and Myanmar is the best example of that. Literally bordering, essentially, it's like the wedge in between China and yet, of course, Bangladesh, the most important UN, the heavy United Nations donating nation of probably one of the most UN involved nations in the world. But yes, India, right? So we have these two sort of Asian superpowers, and between them we have Myanmar, which is quite large. And can you imagine the behind the scenes influence which is taking place? If we know on paper that Russia and North Korea are now at least being actively becoming involved with the junta, there are a lot of powerful eyes watching these poor innocent people die in these jungles. And yes, it's just escalating. Things are getting a lot worse on the ground there. So it's very reminiscent of, yeah, those Cold War conflicts in South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And it really does show that the humankind, say, without a real focus on like Christianity and sort of Christian values. And I don't mean this in an airy fairy sense, but there are really strong vengeance-led demonic influences in world affairs and geopolitics, and this is just a clear example of that. Human lives are being taken en masse, and a lot of innocents are completely being displaced, their lives being destroyed. It's just tragedy, and we don't even hear about it on the news. Like me and Conrad, like it's quite hard to actually find these stories of Myanmar, isn't it, Conrad? Like actually well-written articles where people go like on the ground into these jungles and do the research. It's like these things do not come easily because nobody really wants to cover the suffering of the innocent people in these like unknown jungles and really far off places. It's not like Ukraine, it's not a European country, but at the same time, the lives of these people are still being destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, the Myanmar script is one of the more esoteric looking writing languages in the world. People in Myanmar do not generally speak English. If you've watched like the Bald and Bankrupt episode where he goes there, it's one of the lowest English countries in the world that he's ever visited. And it's in the north of Myanmar right now, specifically the city of Lashio, which seems to be a large enough city, is under current 48 hours of strikes from the Tatmadaw after it was recently taken by the People's Defense Forces in the past week. So again, big. It's a whole front. It's a nationwide front. The entire country is in a state of perpetual war. Cells rise up, they fall. Random cells rise up, attack police stations. They attack the local military bases. The military bases rise back up, kick them out, launch missiles. It's a very interesting conflict. Maybe I'll write an article exploring it more if I can get some time to, like Dimitri said, read more into it, translate some articles, maybe talk to some people that have spent time there or even live there currently. But we got to move on a little bit. We're running a little bit out of time. We probably need to talk about the brief situations going on in Africa. We know that the Sahel Confederation is being discussed. We also know that Ethiopia, Somalia, Somaliland, that whole region, in East Africa is heating up. We hear that there's apparent troop buildup in Djibouti. Somaliland feels threatened. We hear, again, we mentioned last week that Turkey told Ethiopia that Somalia proper, the Mogadishu central government, once it regains total control, will give Ethiopia a port like it is demanding from Somalia. I don't know if Djibouti is going to work with Mogadishu to somehow totally kick Somaliland out and end that political entity. We see the rapid support forces in Sudan taking more and more territory. So this whole region is heating up, all the while the Houthis continue to dominate the Red Sea. So this waterway and this region of Africa is very much in the hot seat right now as far as World War III is concerned. And, we're seeing posts on TikTok about Somalia invading Ethiopia from like Somalian TikTok Zoomers are making edits and whatnot, which is pretty funny. I don't know if Somalia currently is capable of launching a war on Ethiopia without immense Turkish support, but the Turks are trying to ameliorate all of this. The Turks, really coming through as the peacemakers of modern times, or at least Erdogan attempting to be sort of this peacemaker, which is quite interesting. But Dimitri, I want to know your thoughts on, some of this East Africa stuff, as well as, we probably also need to talk about Transnistria, and then we can talk about Biden and Trump.
Yeah, I think these stories coming out of Africa, they're quite like natural progressions of the other issues we discussed like last year, and of course going into 2024. Even though some of them died down for a little bit, like the situation in Burkina Faso, Mali, ECOWAS, that opposition, and of course we do know ECOWAS, it existed since 1975, so we are looking at its 50-year anniversary next year. It is a long-standing economic union of, say, if you're looking at a map, it is essentially the northwest portion of the African continent. And these economic unions, think about it, African politics, Conrad, they don't really last longer than, even domestic alliances don't last very long in Africa because there's constant coups, unrest, foreign influence. Again, as we mentioned, since the Cold War, countries, governments being displaced. A certain government lasting for 10 years in power is already an achievement, let alone a generation. But an economic union like ECOWAS, and of course, it's heavily influenced by French dominance, we do know, and NGOs and things like that. So this is why it's a little bit skeptical, especially countries like Russia and China view ECOWAS as a bit of a pawn sort of economic organization, but it still has the infrastructure. Meanwhile, the free ECOWAS suspended states, that is the free states which recently had the coups, right? The most recent coup in Niger, and of course Mali, Burkina Faso, which we hear a lot about recently. They have these free suspended ECOWAS states have formed this new alliance of Sahel states. The free leaders of the Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have met up. The free leaders, they all have a few things in common, but they're looking to essentially, I think, create an alternative organization, an economic slash military alliance of sorts called the Alliance of the Sahel States. This is very much still an on the papers sort of situation. They haven't had any joint military exercises of any sorts. The only of course, joint interest they do have is because all three of them oppose British, French influence, Western influence, and of course the influence of Islamist organizations, which are now operating, of course, in I believe northeast Mali, as well as countries next door, such as Libya. There's a lot of action going on there with Islamists, probably Western funded, but who knows? These Wahhabi Salafists, they could be inspired by their own sort of weird Islamic, sectarian false teachings. So they are all Islamist opposed, and they are all three of the leaders of these countries came to power via coups. And naturally, the other thing that links all of them is that they all sought assistance from Wagner. And this is where this interestingly ties into Somalia, because Somalia is seeking assistance from Turkey to build up its navy, train its naval, its official national navy, not the weirdo pirates we've been seeing along the east coast of Africa, in movies, films, and news stories throughout the last few decades. But the actual navy of Somalia is being reinforced by Turkey, and we have Russia through Wagner reinforcing the ground militaries of these landlocked countries, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, as well as their neighbors. So it's very curious how both Turkey and Russia are very heavily militarily involved in Africa, sort of bolstering these states.
Yeah, on World Affairs blog, it talks about how, apart from a joint investment bank and a rotating presidency assumed by Mali's Assimi Goïta for 1 year, it's yet to be announced what powers, if any, the Sahel Confederacy would have at the confederal level. So this is all still being worked out. These countries are still kind of holding themselves down from potential French backlash for French, re-coups, as you could call them, to bring them back into the French sphere of influence, which is one of the main reasons why Macron was going so hard against Russia, why he was pushing for troops in Ukraine, why he was talking about retaking Crimea, because he has the most to lose of all of these Western European countries, because Russia was actively dismantling the French Empire in Africa as the war in Ukraine was going on. So obviously he was going to lean that direction. But again, this Sahel Confederacy is very much likely being supported by Russia and Russian political operators on the ground. We know that in fact, we even saw in the Kenyan violence against that, the proposed tax laws, those huge protests in Kenya where they stormed the Senate and beat people up, there were Russian flags in the audience. And I'm not going to say that it was a pro-Russian coup or anything like that, but there's definitely this consciousness in Africa and the third world that view, Russia, China, and the more BRICS-aligned things as this sort of resistance against what they view as the financier class of their former colonial oppressors. So very interesting developments across the continent. Obviously, Gabon, some of these other less relevant countries have also had coups that have disrupted the Atlanticist world order. So we're going to be keeping an eye on it, of course. We know Egypt is going to have to be involved in the negotiations with Hamas and Israel, with the Philadelphia corridor that Israel now occupies, which was a red line for Egypt and all of these sorts of things. And that may configure in with Sudan and Ethiopia and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Who knows if Ethiopia will be leaned on by Israel to pressure Egypt a certain way with the water. This is, where deep geopolitics gets in, and why an apparatus like the State Department is able to dominate it, because they have more people, more resources, and the ability to get information and dominate these multifaceted conversations that span languages and cultures, but involve major waterways, military force, religious sectarian issues. This is why, the complex systems that are controlled by world Jewry are able to outmaneuver the forces of good that arise in any given nation state, because, they operate at this multinational meta level, which is unfortunate. And thankfully, we know that God is in control, and we see these prophecies that, the prophecies work at a level even greater than what, the Jewish controllers can even think to. And we're going to see, of course, the rise of orthodoxy in the midst of all of this turbulence and this tribulation that we're living through right now. But speaking of prophecies, it seems that Azerbaijan is on the verge of recognizing Northern Cyprus. We talked about this a few weeks back. Yes, the president of the Republic of Northern Cyprus, the Turkish-occupied northern third of the region that is not recognized by any country besides Turkey, is actually in Baku for the Organization of Turkic States Summit, which I'm sure is being organized around the SCO and these other things that are going on in Kazakhstan and everywhere else. They kind of have a lot of these conferences in tandem. But, if this president is there, he's meeting with Aliyev, and if Erdogan is smoothing things over with Assad and all of these other things, and Iran is, now more inclined to support the Turkosphere, Azerbaijan is probably like, it's time. And Northern Cyprus is like, yes, it is time to gain another UN recognized state onto our belt so that we can move towards legitimacy. But this will undoubtedly usher in a response from Greece, which is very interesting. It may continue to increase militarization on its islands, which again, it's already doing. I don't know exactly how Greece could respond to this, but it'll be very interesting to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in terms of like militarization and countries getting involved in one another's affairs, we do have that recent SCO sort of going back to that story in Astana, Kazakhstan. The very weird Astana kind of, the name invokes the name Satana, Satan. Very interesting sort of Masonic city in the steppes and plains of Kazakhstan. But of course, President Putin was there, Erdogan. Lukashenko's foreign minister, Ryzhenkov, was there, and naturally he spoke to Xi Jinping, and Belarus is very keen on becoming involved and, recognized as a member of the SCO, of course, becoming not just the member of the Eurasian Union and just a union state with Russia, like the last sort of vestige of the Soviet Union. The Belarusian relations with Russia are very curious, but Belarus is very heavily involved economically with China in terms of purchasing a lot of Chinese goods, that which Belarus does not manufacture itself, it of course imports from both Russia and China proper, as opposed to Europe, which there are a lot of sanctions on Belarus on the European end, and Belarus frankly doesn't export much at all. So it's a very interesting country economically speaking. It does depend a lot on, say, Russian subsidies and subsidized Russian raw resources. So it's a very interesting, weird satellite type state. But Lukashenko, I think, recognizes the preeminence of China, and so being involved with the SCO, especially going forward, Erdogan being present there, being involved with all these countries who will make up the future of Eurasia. Belarus wants to be part of that picture. Belarus, I think, especially now since it's been left out of European politics and called like the sick man of Europe in a way, like kind of a throwback to the Ottoman Empire of the First World War, it does view itself more as perhaps a Eurasian nation rather than a European state, despite the fact that it's literally almost on the Baltic coast, right? It is as European as you can get, right? Belarusian is even called like White Rus, like it's, how more European can you get? Although, yes, Lukashenko is looking more towards the Baron Ungern type of view, perhaps viewing himself as like a future member of the steppe community, like a Mongolian warlord of the future. But perhaps we're getting a bit carried away, Conrad. There are news from Transnistria and Moldova, I think, prior to sort of wrapping up this episode. If maybe you can mention that real quick, because we are still speaking about these post-Soviet states and essentially how they're maneuvering around modern political realities.
Yeah, just really quick, Moldova and Transnistria, they're, coming to some disagreements as usual. There was going to be some kind of new path forward to recognition of each other that was going to be signed, but that's been rejected. And this is a headline from Wallachian Gazette. The Moldovan Energy Minister Viktor Parlikov refuses to take responsibility in the event that Ukraine cuts Russian natural gas supplies to Transnistria. Parlikov stated that the responsibility falls on the company Moldova Gas, a subsidiary of Gazprom, and Gazprom itself to work out a deal and deliver natural gas to Transnistria if Ukraine shuts down the West Line. Alternative routes could come from the Turk Stream or the East Line of Blue Stream, which goes under the Black Sea, but yeah, that's all involved with the Turks. So again, it appears that the Transnistrians may be in big trouble. The Ukrainians, I guess, want to punish them and cut off their gas, despite the fact that Russia has continued to pump gas all the way through Ukraine. I guess Ukraine feels the need to punish the Transnistrians, the Pridnestrovians, as I guess we should be calling them. But again, we haven't been talking as much about Pridnestrovia recently, but again, if Kherson gets taken and Russia continues to move along the Black Sea coast, I think that question is definitely going to come up again, especially as the Romania-Moldova integration conversation continues, because if Moldova becomes a NATO state, Russia is going to want every inch of territory that it can and want Transnistria to help protect itself, because I don't think it's going to want to accept a Moldova in NATO at all, and it'll need to exercise soft power. It would, I think, want to have Odessa to be able to influence the politics of the region. So again, Transnistria always a key in the Russian game that we are seeing unfold, as it appears that the peace process is on the verge of beginning in perhaps a real capacity. We will see how Transnistria factors into that. But I think the only other things I really have to mention, Dmitry, unless you have some updates on Ukrainian persecution, is the general situation in the US. And I don't really have much to say that probably hasn't already been said. It seems that Biden is going to stay in the race, at least until the convention. And I've heard some speculation that if they are going to replace him, it's actually going to be way later in the game, like even more last minute. I don't know how that's possible. I think if they did that, he would have to die. So perhaps they're planning a perfect way to kill Biden, because again, at this point, states like Wisconsin, states that the Dems need to win to beat Trump, will have completely restricted ballot access if they come in with a new candidate, because Biden is that candidate. The only way that he could be replaced in places like that are if he dies. So again, we're going to be watching all of that closely. But you mentioned the Orban thing about him perhaps carrying messages to Zelensky and Putin on behalf of Trump. That's probably correct, and Trump is kind of already acting as the assumed winner in November as of right now. And Biden, the fact that he had to consider dropping out of this race while he is the sitting president, it's like kind of also admitting that you're not really in power to begin with at all. And I think it was like the Sopranos account on Twitter posted the Tony Soprano quote, like, if you got to keep telling people you're the boss, you ain't the boss. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now. But yeah, I mean, Trump is going to win in November. He's going to do a lot of great things for Israel, so it's not really going to be that revolutionary. Nick Fuentes mentioned it this week. Trump's disavowing Project 2025, talking about stapling green cards to diplomas. We're hearing rumors of West Bank annexation, all of these other things. So again, I love Trump as a guy. I support, what he's done for the consciousness. Who knows how red-pilled I'd even be right now if it wasn't for what happened in 2016. But at the end of the day, it doesn't appear that Zog is going to be defeated in this election, or that's ever even been possible in our lifetimes for an election to be something that could defeat Zog. So here we are on that. But Dmitry, if you have any updates on Ukrainian persecution or comments on any of these other stories, we could probably start to land this plane.
Yeah, I think two of the stories which really caught my eyes, and that this is very explicit. So, an elderly priest, Father Boris Brodovsky, is naturally Ukrainian sort of name. He was finally sentenced to 3 years of imprisonment for a Facebook post, an anti-Ukrainian, well, not even anti-Ukrainian, I would say pro-Russian, Orthodox Christian, very traditional conservative Facebook post, wherein he stated that, well, look, when I was a young man, I swore an oath to defend the Soviet Union, and I never swore an oath to say anything pro-Ukrainian. Then he states Ukraine as a country is artificial. It's a bath bubble inflated and invented by America. And there is a plan to have Slavs kill one another in this war and to hate one another. Do we agree with Father Boris? Absolutely. There's definitely, Rebbe Schneerson spoke about this, right? So we do know what the Chabad is planning behind the scenes. There's always that sort of plan ongoing, right? These people play checkers and chess at the same time, and probably Chinese Go as well. It's a multifaceted game behind the scenes, and Father Boris now is sentenced to 3 years of prison, so we need to keep him in our prayers. Very sad that Ukrainian priest, on the SBU photographs released from his house, he actually had behind his icon corner the painting of Ilya Glazunov, the famous Eternal Russia painting, which we all know, which has all the Russian saints, heroes, as well as different periods, key periods of Russian history in the background. And of course, the crucifixion of Christ on the cross in the middle of it, with the Kremlin in the background. Beautiful painting. And essentially, he had a big poster there behind his iconostasis, which is quite epic, I would say. Ilya Glazunov was a very pious Orthodox Christian artist in Russia in the late USSR, and only recently passed away during the COVID years. But the other, I think, big story, Conrad, is that the Ukrainian media is now spreading the fake news that Metropolitan Arseny of Svetogorsk was the one who invited Strelkov to commence the 2014, Donbass coup in Ukraine. And allegedly, he hid Strelkov and some of these, right-wing Russian monarchist commanders in his Svetogorsk monastery. And they're spreading literally the fakest news, when we have on paper, we know who picked Strelkov up, we know which cars he took, we know which highways he drove down in order to get to Slavyansk in 2014 in April. So we know exactly his route, and he's explained it verbally himself to Ukrainian media like Dmitry Gordon and even Russian media sources, and it's not really disputed. Svetogorsk Svetogorsk Lavra was not visited by Strelkov. Yeah, Strelkov does know a lot of monks from that Lavra, but they're blaming Metropolitan Arsenius, claiming that he almost like caused the freaking 2014 civil war in Ukraine. Like, again, Ukrainian media loves to lie about Orthodox clergy. This does not surprise us. And I think the scariest article, which most people should at least look at the abstract sort of synopsis of, is if you Google The Lancet, this is an article which really paints it as to what is taking place in the Middle East. And listen to our episode of Isaac, really covers the sort of the tragedy that's taking place in the Levant. It's titled Counting the Dead in Gaza, Difficult but Essential, which shows that the real death count in Gaza is not in fact 37,500 as is being reported quite often, but it's closing in on over 180,000 people that have been killed since October in Gaza, not just from the bombing, but through lack of infrastructure, through the destruction of medical care. The general humanitarian crisis has taken over a quarter, close to a fifth of a million of people's lives. So the mass slaughter of people continues in the Levant, in Ukraine, and I think the plans of the evil one are still in power. But, through prayers, I think we'll get over it and we will win in the end. So definitely a packed episode, some major stories, and I think going into next week, a lot more things will begin making sense, Conrad.
No, I totally agree. And everybody be sure, like you said, to check out the episode with Isaac. It's going to be linked below. Check out his podcast as well if you want to stay more updated from the Palestinian perspective on the war in the Holy Land. But with all of that, I think we're going to wrap this thing up. Be sure to subscribe, worldwarnow.co. Get behind that paywall. It supports the show. Like I said, I'm doing this full time now, so your support is more necessary than ever for us to keep the content going. You get access to all 44 plus episodes of our Ether Hour. You get access to the full versions of our articles, which are going to be more forthcoming. And again, you support the show because we give the free show World War Now every week for everybody so that the news about World War III and these prophecies and the Orthodox Church can be spread. But again, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com, both links work. Follow us on Twitter, worldwarnow_. We're doing really well on there. Be sure to subscribe to the Telegram, World War Now Telly. That's another great place, 24/7 news feed. I'm on Twitter at Gnomrad, Gnomrad, with a G at the beginning. Dimitri is on Twitter at OCanonist. We're on Rumble as well, World War Now. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all sorts of other podcast listeners. If you go to Substack, if you go to the worldwarnow.co website, there should be more options, and it should give you an RSS link and some kind of subscription link on whatever podcast service you want to listen to. So be sure to check that out. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, of course, World War Now. If you're on Substack, be sure that you're also subscribed on YouTube. Leave comments, like those videos. Really helps us out. It's a great vector for growth and reach for normies that are just looking for videos and whatnot to watch about politics. So again, thank you so much for the support. Check the links below. Subscribe to the links that we just mentioned. And with all of that, thank you so much. We'll see you on the next one. God bless.